Today, in Canada, most parents assume their child will grow up. First birthdays are planned. Nurseries are painted. Names are chosen months in advance. Because losing a baby in the first year of life is rare. And for mothers, childbirth has become very safe. Doctors are minutes away. Hospitals glow softly through the night. Clean water runs without question. Medicine waits within reach. Each breath, each heartbeat, quietly monitored. Safety feels ordinary now, almost guaranteed. But it was not always like this, not even close. When Canada first became a nation in 1867, nearly 1 child in 5 would never see a first birthday. And for the women who gave birth to them, survival was never guaranteed. There were no blood banks, no antibiotics, no emergency surgery teams, no universal health care, only distance, cost, and chance. The country was rural, scattered, immense. Farmhouses dotted river valleys. Fishing villages clung to the coasts. Small settlements pushed into forests and prairie grasslands. Roads were rough. Winters were long. Travel could take hours or days. If labor pains began in the night, there was rarely time to fetch a doctor. And even if there had been time, many families simply could not afford one. Healthcare was not a public service. It was a privilege. A doctor charged for every visit, every mile traveled, every hour spent at a bedside. For a laborer or farmer, that fee might equal a week's wages. So most births happened at home, in bedrooms warmed by wood stoves, on mattresses stuffed with straw, attended by a neighbor, a relative, or a midwife whose knowledge came from experience rather than formal training. Sometimes everything went smoothly. A baby cried, a mother rested, life continued. But when something went wrong, there was little anyone could do. If bleeding would not stop, it simply did not stop. If infection set in, it spread unchecked. If the baby was positioned poorly, there were no surgical options waiting down the hall. Nature decided, and nature could be indifferent. Infants, too, lived precariously. The first year of life was a narrow bridge. Many never crossed it. Milk spoiled quickly in summer heat. Water sources carried unseen bacteria. Houses were crowded. Windows stayed shut against winter cold. Disease moved easily from child to child. Whooping cough, measles, diphtheria, diarrheal illnesses that dehydrated tiny bodies in a matter of days. A baby might weaken in the morning and be gone by nightfall. Parents learned not to celebrate too soon. Some families delayed naming a child until months had passed. It felt safer not to grow attached too quickly. Love, though, rarely listens to logic, and so grief became a regular visitor. Small wooden coffins, tiny graves near churchyards, names carved shallowly into stone. Through the 1870s, railway lines stitched towns together, but medicine lagged behind expansion. Doctors were still scarce outside cities. A physician might serve hundreds of square miles. In winter, snow swallowed roads and isolated families completely. If complications began, help might never arrive. There are quiet accounts from these years, diary entries, letters, describing fathers riding through storms for hours to find assistance, only to return too late. A house silent, a wife gone, a newborn wrapped in blankets beside her. The practical consequences were immediate. Without a mother, households faltered. Meals went uncooked, laundry piled. Older daughters left school to care for siblings. Infants, deprived of breastfeeding, faced even higher odds of illness. Some fathers remarried quickly out of necessity, not romance. Others simply could not cope. A single death often unraveled an entire family. By the 1880s, cities like Montreal and Toronto began building larger hospitals. But these were not places most people visited willingly. Hospitals were associated with charity or desperation, and they still required payment. To step through their doors meant admitting both illness and expense. So many stayed home instead. Even when safer care existed only streets away, poverty quietly shaped mortality. Wealthier families could summon physicians early, purchase cleaner milk, afford rest for expectant mothers. Poorer families returned to work days after childbirth. Exhaustion weakened immune systems. Small infections turned deadly. 2 babies born on the same day in the same city could face completely different futures depending on nothing more than income. Survival still was unequal. As the 1890s approached, reformers began counting more carefully. For the first time, governments and doctors attempted to measure loss. The numbers were sobering. In some communities, nearly 200 infants out of every 1,000 births died within a year. Almost 1 in 5. Imagine a classroom where several desks remain permanently empty. Imagine a family photo where only half the children lived long enough to stand for it. And maternal deaths remained woven into daily life. Childbed fever swept through homes without warning. A slight chill, a rising temperature, then delirium. Within days, a husband might find himself digging 2 graves instead of preparing a cradle. These were not rare tragedies. They were familiar ones, so familiar that neighbors often brought casseroles and helped with chores as if responding to bad weather. Loss had become routine. At the turn of the century, small changes began appearing. Cities invested in cleaner water systems. Garbage collection improved. Public health nurses visited new mothers, offering advice on hygiene and feeding. Milk depots distributed safer supplies. Simple interventions. Boil the water, wash hands, air out rooms. The results were modest but noticeable. Some babies who might have died now survived. Some mothers recovered instead of fading. The curve of mortality bent slightly downward, almost imperceptibly, but it was bending. For the first time, people began to suspect these deaths were not fate. They were preventable. And if something is preventable, it can be changed. By 1900, the scale of infant loss across Canada still hovered near 187 deaths per 1,000 live births, a staggering figure by modern standards. Yet families carried on. They planted crops, built homes, had more children. Hope persisted, stubborn and human. Because even in hardship, life insisted on moving forward. Hospitals grew larger. Nursing became formalized. Antiseptic practices slowly spread. More births shifted indoors, under trained supervision. Each small improvement layered atop the last. None dramatic. All cumulative. Like stones slowly reinforcing a fragile bridge. And so, as the first decade of the new century unfolded, something subtle began to change in the air. Not safety yet, not certainty, but possibility. The idea that birth did not have to be a gamble. That perhaps distance should not decide survival. That perhaps care should not belong only to those who could pay. By 1910, Canada still remained a place where childbirth carried real danger, where small graves still dotted churchyards, where families still whispered anxious prayers through the night. But the belief was forming, quietly, steadily, that these losses were not simply the way of the world. They were problems, and problems could be solved. And as industry expanded, as cities modernized, as public health slowly organized itself into something more coordinated and more deliberate, the fragile boundary between life and death began shifting faster than before, setting the stage for a new era where hospitals would grow, governments would step closer into medicine, and the next decades would challenge old assumptions in ways few families in 1910 could yet imagine. As the country moved toward years shaped by war, reform, and the first true steps toward health care that belonged not just to the fortunate, but to everyone. The years after 1910 did not announce themselves with sudden miracles. There was no single discovery that made childbirth safe overnight. Instead, change arrived the way most real change does, quietly, unevenly, layered one improvement atop another. A new sink in a clinic, a nurse trained differently, a rule about boiling instruments, small things. But small things repeated across a nation begin to alter outcomes. By the early 1910s, Canada was becoming more urban. Factories multiplied. Rail lines tightened the distance between provinces. Families left isolated farms for towns where work and doctors were closer together. Hospitals, once places of last resort, slowly became places of prevention. Not comfortable yet, not modern, but more present. In maternity wards, antiseptic practices began to take hold. Hands were washed, instruments sterilized, sheets boiled. It sounds ordinary now. At the time, it was revolutionary, because for decades, infection had been the invisible killer. A healthy mother could survive childbirth only to succumb days later to bacteria introduced by unclean tools or hands. Once physicians accepted germ theory fully, the idea that microscopic organisms caused disease, maternal deaths from childbed fever, began slowly to decline. Not everywhere, not evenly, but enough that some communities noticed something unfamiliar. More mothers were getting out of bed. More babies were surviving that first fragile week. Then came 1914. War. The First World War did not directly change childbirth, yet it changed almost everything around it. Thousands of Canadian doctors and nurses served overseas. Military medicine advanced quickly under pressure. Techniques for surgery, sanitation, triage, and blood management improved out of necessity. Hard lessons learned in field hospitals would later return home. At the same time, the war-strained families left behind. With fathers gone, women worked longer hours in factories and farms. Pregnancy often unfolded alongside physical exhaustion and poor nutrition. And then, in 1918, another threat arrived. Not with guns, but with breath. The influenza pandemic. It moved like weather across the country, town by town, street by street. Entire households sick at once, hospitals overwhelmed, doctors exhausted. For pregnant women, influenza could be devastating. High fevers, pneumonia, dehydration. Miscarriages increased. Maternal deaths rose in waves. Infants born during the outbreak sometimes entered a world where both parents were already ill. In some homes, neighbors became caretakers overnight. In others, there was simply no one left strong enough to help. Communities remember those months in a particular way. church bells ringing too often, funerals held quickly, graves dug before the ground fully thawed. It was a stark reminder that even as medicine improved, life remained fragile. Progress could stall, even reverse. When the pandemic passed and the 1920s unfolded, something like optimism returned. Cities modernized faster, indoor plumbing spread, clean municipal water systems expanded, sewage treatment improved. These public works projects rarely made headlines for health reasons, yet they saved thousands of infant lives. Because diarrheal disease, once one of the most common killers of babies, depended on contaminated water. Remove the contamination, and deaths quietly fell. No dramatic breakthrough, just fewer funerals, fewer small coffins. Parents began to notice that more of their children were reaching school age. Something that had once felt uncertain now felt slightly more dependable. Hospitals, too, changed character. Maternity wards expanded. Training schools for nurses grew more formal. Midwifery practices merged with professional standards. More births took place indoors, under supervision. Doctors developed clearer methods for handling obstructed labor. Forceps improved. Cesarean operations, though still risky, became more survivable. Each advancement shaved a little more risk away. But still, care was not equal, because hospitals still charged fees. Doctors still built families. If you had money, you delivered under bright lights. If you did not, you stayed home and hoped. The divide persisted, quiet, unspoken, but real. Then came 1929, the stock market crash, the beginning of the Great Depression, and suddenly, whatever fragile progress families had made felt uncertain again. Jobs vanished, savings evaporated, men stood in long lines for work that never came. Pregnancy did not pause for economic crisis. Babies continued arriving into homes already stretched thin. Malnutrition increased. Expectant mothers ate less so their children could eat more. Medical bills became luxuries few could justify. Even when hospitals were closer and safer, many simply could not afford them. So the old patterns returned. Home births, delayed care, waiting too long to seek help. Infant and maternal mortality did not skyrocket everywhere, but the steady improvements slowed, plateaued, because medicine cannot fully protect those who cannot access it. For some families, the hardship was cumulative. A sick child meant missing work. Missing work meant less income. Less income meant poorer food and housing, which meant more illness. A cycle that tightened quietly. There are accounts from prairie towns of mothers sewing through the night for extra pennies while pregnant, of fathers selling tools to pay doctor fees, of older children leaving school to support the household after a parent's death. One loss rarely stood alone. It rippled outward, economically, emotionally, generationally. And yet within these hard years, an idea began to take root. A question, asked more frequently: why should survival depend on wealth? If clean water could be public, if roads could be public, why not medical care? Why should calling a doctor risk financial ruin? It was not a radical thought at first, just practical. Communities began experimenting. Small municipal programs, charity hospitals, local insurance pools, early attempts to spread cost across many families instead of burdening one. Because by now, the pattern was undeniable. Where care was accessible, deaths fell faster. Where it was not, mortality lingered. The link was too clear to ignore. As the 1930s edged toward the 1940s, scientific breakthroughs accelerated. Sulfa drugs appeared. Then, toward the end of the decade, penicillin. For the first time in history, bacterial infections that once killed routinely could be stopped. A fever after childbirth no longer automatically meant death. A newborn's infection might be treated instead of endured. The effect was dramatic, quietly dramatic. Maternal deaths from infection dropped. Infant survival improved. Doctors who had once felt helpless now had tools, real tools, not guesses, not prayers. Medicine was finally gaining leverage over fate. And then, once again, the world shifted. 1939, war returned. The Second World War mobilized the entire country. Medical organizations scaled rapidly. Training standardized. Blood transfusion services expanded. Emergency care improved. What had once been scattered became coordinated. After the war, those systems did not simply vanish. They followed soldiers home. Hospitals were larger, better staffed, better equipped. And Canadians, having witnessed what collective effort could accomplish, began expecting more from their institutions. Not charity, not privilege, but structure, reliability, care that did not depend on luck. Because by now, a new truth had become impossible to ignore. Infant and maternal mortality were not fixed laws of nature. They were reflections of how a society chose to care for its people. And in the years just ahead, as the country stepped into the late 1940s, with fresh memory of hardship and a growing belief that health might belong to everyone, the first serious experiments with hospital insurance and publicly supported medical care were about to begin, quietly reshaping childbirth once again. Not through a single discovery, but through something even more powerful: access. Because once the war ended and soldiers returned home, Canada did not simply resume where it had left off. The country felt different, larger, more organized, more aware of what coordinated systems could accomplish. During the war, governments had learned how to mobilize railways, factories, food supplies, and entire populations with startling efficiency. Hospitals had expanded. Blood banks had been created. Nurses trained by the thousands. Emergency medicine had matured faster in 6 years than in the previous 50. And when peace settled in after 1945, families looked around and quietly wondered, if we can organize a nation for war, why can't we organize it for health? Through the late 1940s, that question began turning into policy. Not everywhere at once, not smoothly, but steadily. In many towns, hospital bills were still something to fear. A complicated birth might leave a family paying debt for years. Some parents avoided hospital deliveries, even when safer, simply because the cost was too heavy. So provinces began experimenting with something new: insurance plans that spread the risk across entire populations, small monthly payments, shared responsibility. If one family needed surgery or a long hospital stay, everyone helped carry the burden. The earliest large-scale shift came in Saskatchewan, where provincial hospital insurance allowed residents to receive hospital care without paying at the bedside. It was a simple change, paperwork mostly, but its consequences were profound. For the first time, a pregnant woman did not have to ask, "Can we afford this?" She could simply go, and that one removed hesitation. That one eliminated delay, quietly saved lives. More mothers delivered in hospitals. More newborns received immediate attention. Complications were caught sooner, bleeding treated faster, infections addressed early instead of late. The difference between calling for help and waiting often measured only hours. But hours were everything. By the early 1950s, something remarkable was happening. Infant mortality, which had hovered in frightening ranges for generations, began falling more quickly than ever before. Nationally, rates that had once lived in the hundreds per 1,000 births decades earlier were now in the 40s, then drifting downward still. For the first time in Canadian history, the majority of parents could reasonably expect their children to survive infancy. Not hope, expect. It changed the emotional texture of family life. Parents bought fewer extra cradles just in case. They celebrated birthdays with more certainty. Photographs began to include more children growing up together, instead of gaps where siblings had been lost. The sound of small funerals became less common, not gone, but rarer, and maternal survival improved alongside it. Antibiotics transformed childbirth. Postpartum infections that once swept through wards could now be treated in days. Blood transfusions addressed hemorrhage. Safer surgical techniques reduced deaths from obstructed labor. Doctors who once watched helplessly could now intervene. Birth was still serious, still painful, still human, but no longer routinely deadly. And yet, there were tensions. Because universal hospital insurance did not automatically mean universal physician care. A hospital stay might be covered, but the doctor's bill might not be. Families still received invoices, still worried, still hesitated. Access improved, but not completely. The system was halfway between eras, part modern, part old world, which meant some families still fell through the cracks, especially in rural areas, especially in indigenous communities, especially in the North. Distance remained an enemy. A hospital might now be free, but still 100 miles away. And weather did not respect policy. Winter storms still isolated towns. Travel still failed at the worst moments. Progress, again, was uneven. Then came the next step. In the early 1960s, Saskatchewan moved beyond hospital insurance and introduced public medical insurance that covered physician services as well. Not just the building, the care inside it. It was controversial. Doctors protested. Politicians debated. But families noticed something simple. They could see a doctor without opening their wallets first. Gradually, other provinces followed. And by the later 1960s, Canada had laid the foundation for what would become a nationwide system of universal health care. For expectant mothers, the psychological shift was enormous. A prenatal appointment was no longer a financial calculation. It was routine. Blood pressure checks, weight monitoring, early detection of complications, small interventions that prevented large disasters. Infant health improved before birth even began, because care started earlier, regularly, predictably. As the 1970s unfolded, the numbers told a quiet story of transformation. Infant mortality continued its steady descent, into the 20s per 1,000, then the teens, then lower still. What had once been 1 in 5 became 1 in 50, then fewer. Each drop represented thousands of children reaching kindergarten who might once have been buried before their first winter. Hospitals grew more specialized. Neonatal units appeared. Tiny incubators warmed premature babies who previously would never have survived. Respiratory support kept fragile lungs working. Nurses trained specifically for newborn care. For the first time, babies born months early, impossibly small, lighter than a loaf of bread, sometimes lived. It would have seemed miraculous to families of 1867, almost unnatural, and maternal mortality followed a similar path. Hemorrhage managed quickly. Cesarean section safer. Anesthesia improved. Specialists on call. Deaths that once occurred quietly at home now became rare events investigated carefully, learned from, prevented the next time. Childbirth was not risk-free, but it was no longer a gamble against fate. It was medicine, structured, supported, planned, and perhaps most importantly, it was no longer reserved for the fortunate. A farmer's wife, a factory worker, a teacher, an immigrant family newly arrived, all entered the same doors, received the same beds, the same antibiotics, the same chance. For the first time in the country's history, survival at birth depended less on wealth and more on the shared system surrounding everyone. It was not perfect. Disparities remained. Remote communities still struggled. Indigenous families still faced barriers and inequities that statistics often hid. But the national trajectory was unmistakable. Safer, steadier, more humane. By 1980, the contrast with 1867 would have been almost unrecognizable. Where once births happened alone by lamplight, they now unfolded under teams of trained professionals. Where once infections swept unchecked, antibiotics stood ready. Where once families feared the cost of calling a doctor, care had become a public right. And where once nearly a fifth of infants never reached their first birthday, now only a small fraction did not. The silence of tiny graves had grown quieter, not gone, but quieter. And yet, even as those decades closed, new questions began forming at the edges of medicine. Questions about technology, premature survival, chronic illness, and inequalities that statistics alone could not explain. Suggesting that while the long arc of infant and maternal survival had bent dramatically toward safety, the story was not finished, and the years ahead would reveal that progress, like life itself, never truly stops, but simply moves forward into new challenges, waiting to see what the next generation would protect, improve, or overlook. Because history has a quiet pattern. Every time a society believes it has solved something completely, reality answers with complexity. And so, as Canada crossed into the 1980s, the story of birth and survival did not end. It simply entered a different phase. Less about preventing immediate death, more about managing risk. Less about whether a baby would live, more about how well. By the early 1980s, infant mortality had fallen into single digits per 1,000 live births, a number that would have been inconceivable a century earlier. Hospitals were now the default place of birth. Prenatal visits were routine. Ultrasound imaging allowed doctors to see the fetus before delivery, a quiet revolution in itself. For the first time, complications could be anticipated weeks in advance instead of discovered in the moment. Placenta problems, breech positioning, multiple births, all visible, all planned for. Birth became something scheduled, managed, observed. The unpredictability that had haunted earlier generations slowly receded, not gone, but tamed. Neonatal intensive care units, NICUs, expanded through major cities. Rooms filled with soft light and steady mechanical sounds. Incubators, ventilators, monitors that translated tiny heartbeats into green lines across a screen. Babies born months early, once considered too small to survive, now had a chance. Some weighing less than 2 pounds, some small enough to fit in a pair of adult hands. In earlier eras, these infants would have been wrapped in blankets and held until the inevitable. Now they were treated, supported, kept warm and breathing by technology that bordered on miraculous. Survival, again, expanded. The boundary of life pushed earlier and earlier. For mothers, too, care grew more sophisticated. High-risk pregnancy clinics emerged. Specialists focused solely on obstetrics. Blood pressure disorders, diabetes, and infections were monitored closely. Cesarean deliveries became safer and more controlled. What had once been a desperate last resort became a standard surgical procedure. Still serious, but rarely fatal. The tone around childbirth changed. Older generations spoke about birth with caution. Younger generations began to speak about it with confidence. It was no longer something you survived. It was something you planned, packed a bag for, scheduled around work. That psychological shift alone marked how far the country had traveled. Through the 1990s, infant mortality continued its gradual decline. Public health campaigns targeted smoking during pregnancy, car seat safety, breastfeeding education, vaccination programs, not dramatic interventions, but cumulative ones, each shaving a small fraction from risk, like sanding down rough edges. By now, losing a baby in the first year had become uncommon enough that each case felt deeply personal rather than statistically expected. When deaths did occur, they were investigated, studied, lessons extracted. Nothing was simply accepted anymore. The culture had changed. Loss was no longer fate. It was failure to be understood and prevented. Maternal mortality, too, had fallen to historically low levels. Deaths during childbirth had become rare events, measured not in dozens per community, but in small national figures. And yet, paradoxically, the story grew more complicated, because modern life introduced new challenges that earlier centuries had not faced. Women began having children later in life, into their 30s, into their 40s. Chronic conditions, hypertension, diabetes, obesity became more common. Pregnancy, which once occurred mostly among the young and physically resilient, now often intersected with complex medical histories. Medicine was stronger, but the cases were more complicated. So progress slowed. Instead of dramatic drops, there were plateaus, small fluctuations, years that improved, years that ticked slightly upward. The easy victories were over. What remained required nuance, coordination, long-term support. By the early 2000s, infant mortality in Canada hovered around 5 deaths per 1,000 live births, a staggering contrast to the nearly 187 per 1,000 at the start of the 20th century, a reduction of more than 95%. Numbers that quietly represented tens of thousands of children growing up who, in another era, would not have. Graduating, working, starting families of their own. Entire generations alive because of clean water, antibiotics, trained nurses, and universal access to care. And yet, beneath those averages, disparities remained. Northern communities still faced distance. Indigenous families often encountered barriers to consistent care. Remote regions struggled to recruit doctors. Helicopter evacuations replaced horse rides, but distance still mattered. Geography still shaped outcomes. History had not erased inequality. It had only changed its form. As the 2010s unfolded, technology continued its quiet advance. electronic fetal monitoring, safer anesthesia, better surgical protocols, mental health screening for postpartum depression. Care expanded beyond survival alone. It began to include quality of life, recovery, support. The system that once fought simply to keep mothers and infants alive now focused on helping them thrive. And still, the numbers moved slowly downward. Infant mortality edging closer to 4 per 1,000. Maternal deaths remaining uncommon, though carefully tracked. Each loss examined not as inevitability, but as a problem to solve. A mindset unimaginable to families of 1867 who had simply endured. Then came the early 2020s, a global pandemic. Hospitals strained again, staff exhausted, protocols shifting overnight. For a moment, the country felt a faint echo of older centuries. Uncertainty, fear, the realization that systems can bend under pressure. Expectant mothers attended appointments alone. Masks replaced smiles. Visits shortened. Yet the foundation built over decades held. Babies continued to be born safely. Mothers continued to receive care. Even in crisis, the structure endured. A quiet testament to how far the system had matured since the days when a snowstorm could mean the difference between life and death. And now, in 2025, the contrast is almost difficult to comprehend. Today, more than 99% of Canadian infants reach their first birthday. Maternal deaths are rare enough to be national tragedies when they occur. Healthcare is not perfect, not equal, not finished evolving, but it is shared, a right rather than a privilege, a foundation rather than a gamble. A mother no longer weighs the cost before seeking help. A father no longer rides through the night searching for a doctor who may not come. A newborn's cry is met not with quiet fear, but with expectation, plans, futures, certainty. And yet, the story is not really about numbers, not entirely. It is about what those numbers mean. It means fewer empty chairs at kitchen tables, fewer older siblings forced to become parents overnight, fewer fathers digging graves behind churches in frozen ground. It means more first birthdays, more school photos, more ordinary mornings, the kind of ordinary that once felt miraculous. If we stand still for a moment and look back from 2025 to 1867, the distance feels immense. From lamplight bedrooms to neonatal intensive care, from unpaid midwives to universal hospitals, from 1 child in 5 dying to only a few in 1,000, from healthcare as privilege to healthcare as promise. It did not happen quickly. It did not happen evenly. It happened slowly, generation by generation, through small improvements, public effort, shared responsibility, through the stubborn belief that birth should not be a risk measured by wealth or geography, only by care. And as night settles again across the country, somewhere a child is born. A quiet room, soft light, steady monitors, parents already imagining years ahead, a future assumed, a survival expected, a certainty that would have felt impossible to those first families of Confederation. And that quiet certainty, more than any statistic, may be the clearest measure of how far the journey has carried us.